It feels so weird now when I press record to say, hey, Tatyana, how are you? We already spoke. Let's jump directly into it. I read your book twice. It's brilliant. You write so good, and it's not complicated to read. It's not filled with these quasi intellectual words everybody could understand. My 5-year-old daughter saw the image of this girl holding a heart, and she asked me what it is. And I told her the story, but I put it for the 5-year-old kid to understand. And she wanted to read more. So I ended up reading as a new book for her before sleep. But
Really?
yes, but I had to translate everything on Swedish, and I had to translate everything in a manner that she could understand. But I tried to do it, and now when I finished it, now I'm reading to her Epic of Gilgamesh on Swedish. Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the first epic poems in the world from Mesopotamia, and the next one will be probably Iliad and Odyssey.
It's a very good one.
But let me get back to you. So, what criteria do you use when you're selecting these specific paintings and these specific stories?
Well, first of all, thank you for everything that you've said. I'm so pleased that you found it enjoyable to read, but that it also felt quite accessible, because that was the aim. And I'm so pleased also that it sort of opened up this window for your daughter. So I hope that, yeah, she continues reading into the future, all these sort of intense epic stories. To go back to your question, when it came to selecting these works, there wasn't a specific criteria as such. It was more just works that I found have resonated with me or stayed with me or impacted me because they tell stories that are quite sad or that revolve around the theme of heartbreak, lost love, and tragedy. I found, working as an art historian over these years, that every time I enter a museum or every time I'm doing research, those are the works that really stick with me. Works that tell stories that feel universal yet also extremely personal, and that touch upon the theme of heartbreak. I think it's something we can all relate to. And it is something that feels very intense while you're experiencing it. That was the idea behind it. No specific criteria as such. I like to call it a sort of personalized curation. So it's works that I've enjoyed, that I remember, brought under this single umbrella.
Is there any works that you left out? And if you did, why?
There were a few, yes. I had to leave them out more for practical purposes. I wanted to avoid any sort of artists that weren't currently in the public domain. So that was one sort of practical reason. I wanted the book to be a sort of a varied selection of different artists. So in some cases, one artist that's featured in the book, Sir John Everett Millais, he's done countless paintings that touch upon this theme. And so I had to choose between a few from him, and ultimately settled on one, which is probably one of my favorites in the book. It's The Huguenot, the tragedy of the conflict between love and faith and religion. I wanted it to be one work from an artist so that there was more variety.
How these paintings reflect the cultural or political climates of their respective times when they were made?
Hmm. Well, yeah, that's another interesting element of the book, and it wasn't my intention, but I think organically it sort of happened because it's the same theme that the book is dealing with, but it's through the lens of all these different artists that come from different places, from different time periods, as you said. So it does shed light on different cultural situations. To bring up a specific example, there's a painting by a Russian artist. And I know Russian art isn't often really looked at, but it's in the book purely just because I love the painting and the story that it tells. It's by Vasily Pukirev, and it's a painting of this young woman being married to this much elderly gentleman. And it's a heartbreaking painting because you just see this young woman completely resigned to her inevitable fate. Her eyes are red because she's been crying. It's obviously a forced and planned marriage. She has no say. And so it really is heartbreaking to see. And her elderly groom is sort of leering down at her with this unsettling expression. That painting provides a very clear, intimate window into what was happening at the time in 19th century Russian society. Younger brides being married to older grooms for the purposes of money, power, family. So that's one example. A lot of the stories, they touch upon famous legends and stories that I'm sure a lot of audiences will recognize. There's Romeo and Juliet in there. There's stories from Ovid's Metamorphosis, from the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. But yes, they all do reflect the different time in which they were written. There's also, going back to Sir John Everett Millais, his paintings about an event that I didn't know prior to studying the painting. It's known today as the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, and it happened in 1572. It was the slaughter of thousands of French Protestants by Roman Catholics. I had no idea about this prior to looking into the painting, which is why art is so fascinating. Just a side note, it really is a lens into history and into how human beings have acted over the years. But anyway, this story, so French Protestants were slaughtered by Roman Catholics on this date. The painting depicts a Huguenot. A Huguenot was a term that was being used to refer to French Protestants, who is deciding to stay true to his faith as a French Protestant, as opposed to pretending to be a Roman Catholic. During this event, a few French Protestants were able to escape slaughter by putting this white armband on their arm, and that was a sign of allegiance to Roman Catholicism. So in this painting, we see this young woman trying to tie this white armband around her lover's arm in an attempt to protect him and to make sure that he doesn't get killed. And we see him looking down at her with such tenderness, but also simultaneously pulling the armband off. So, as a painting already, it's got so much ethos and emotion. And I think even without knowing the context, you can feel the sense of tragedy and the sense of conflict that's occurring. But then as you delve into it, you learn about this very true, very important, very tragic event that did occur, that was a true story, that did ruin thousands of lives. And again, reflects a real political sort of situation. So yeah, all of them do reflect on certain moments, and even how the art is depicted as well, how the stories are depicted, they differ greatly. I also have a painting by Edvard Munch, and it's called Vampire. And I was unsure whether I should include it or not, because the subject matter is quite ambiguous, quite unclear. What we see is this woman leaning over, you could say protectively, you could say aggressively over her lover, sort of cradling him, but also engulfing him. The title suggests that it's quite a violent painting, Vampire. So we get the sense that she's maybe sucking blood from him or consuming him. Her mouth is sort of positioned over the back of his neck, again, to support the thesis of the title. But what I took from it was something else. I took from it, again, this feeling of love, but perhaps a different part of love, the more dangerous side of love. And indeed, the painting originally, one of the earlier titles that it had was Love and Pain. What I'm trying to say with this painting is that it was made much later than the rest. The book is chronological, by the way, so the paintings are featured in chronological order. This was made in the 19th century, in 1895. And rather than having a story depicted literally, so a real story played out, it's more about the emotions and the visceral feel. So it's less sort of immediately digestible. That, of course, reflects the time in which Munch was painting and what he was trying to evoke with his art. There's a variety, definitely, in what was going on and how emotions, in this case, to do with heartbreak and lost love, are evoked.
Speaking of a lot of unknown massacres of religion persecutions, one of them was in 1200s. Tatharans in Italy, Cathars in southern France, Bogomils in Bulgaria and Serbia, and Bosnian Church in Bosnia. They were all slaughtered in the same time. That was precursor to Protestantism. Anyway, you spoke about something really, really interesting here. When you wrote this book and when you chose these artists, do you believe that artists were interested in inserting their personal emotions or experience into these mythologicals or literary scenes?
I think it depends on the artist and the time in which they're painting. A few of the works towards the end, for example, the Munch painting that I mentioned, I think in that instance it's not so much about the story being depicted, but very much so about the emotions that the artist was feeling at the time that are being translated onto canvas. There's one which I love. It's probably one of my favorites in here. It's a painting of Elizabeth Siddal in the guise of Beatrix, who was the eternal love of Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet. And it was painted by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was Elizabeth Siddal's lover. And essentially what it's depicting is after her death. It's a posthumous portrait. Elizabeth sadly and tragically died at quite a young age from a laudanum overdose. She was a fantastic artist and poet in her own right. And she was also one of the most popular models for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, particularly for Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who saw her as his muse. And this painting is very much heavily biographical. So it's all about Rossetti's love and pain at having lost Elizabeth Siddal. Even though it depicts her in the guise of fictional character in this case. Well, not partly fictional. I mean, Beatrix means blessed Beatrice. Beatrice was a real person that Dante Alighieri was enamored with, but the way that she's written about in his Divine Comedy, I think, is heavily through the lens of his own vision. It's through the lens of hope and the sort of, fictional cushion that love can provide. So in that case, the work is heavily involved by biographical happenings. So it does depend. I think art is always most powerful when real emotions can be felt. And I think personally that those real emotions have to come in some part from the creator themselves. So while it may not be the intention, I'd like to think that that's where the intensity of the emotion is coming from, partly from the artist's own experiences as well. I mean, we all experience tragedy, we all experience heartbreak. I think it's inevitable, perhaps, that some of that will sort of translate onto what's being depicted.
How these paintings reflect or reinterpret the myths, the stories, or literary sources they are based on.
In many different ways. I mean, it depends on each of the artworks. What I will say is that what they all have in common, perhaps, is that they depict the most emotionally heightened moment of these narratives. It's always the crux, the emotional high point, as it were, the most dramatic events, the most dramatic feeling. And that's the power of art, because it's a static medium. It just shows one image. It's also, it's two-dimensional. But through that image, you are able to tell an entire story and to evoke all the emotions that come up in that story. So I think that's probably the commonality that they all have. But then again, it does depend, I would say, on the individual works. Let me take an example. Well, we'll take the one that's on the cover, which you had mentioned, which is this painting of a woman who is clutching a human heart. And immediately, of course, just looking at this painting, you're probably thinking, why on earth is she clutching a human heart, and how did she come about to hold it? It's a tragic story, a part of the Decameron that was written by Giovanni Boccaccio. And it's the story of this woman called Gismunda, who falls in love with one of her father's servants, Guiscardo. And of course, her father disapproves of this relationship, so they keep all their meetings a secret. One day, however, her father discovers that they are involved with each other, and he is overcome with fury and jealousy. You have to understand that Gismunda was married once before, and after the death of her first husband, her father forbid her from marrying again. It's unclear, but I mean, the Decameron is full of all these sort of tragic black and white sort of fates, as it were. So anyway, he disapproves of her relationship with Guiscardo. So what he does is he has him killed, and he cuts out his heart and he delivers the heart to Gismunda. The tale in itself is absolutely tragic, but what the artist Bernardino May has chosen to depict is the moment in which Gismunda discovers that Guiscardo has been murdered, and she's actually holding the heart in her right hand. It's arguably, I think, the most emotionally intense moment of the tale. Perhaps not from Guiscardo's point of view, but for us as an audience member, I think it really does strategically heighten the drama of the story. What ends up happening is that Gismunda is so overcome with fury, with heartbreak, that she ends up adding some poison to a cup that holds the heart, and she ends up drinking it to end her own life so that she can be with Guiscardo. So this painting also foreshadows that as well. So I think it's a brilliant moment that's being depicted. Bernardino May has chosen to sort of compress what happens before and what happens after in this one singular scene, because we see Gismunda sort of gazing over her shoulder, and her brow is all intense and furrowed. So we get the sense that she's angry, she's frustrated, but she's also incredibly heartbroken. And we sense that she's looking very directly at something from the context of the story. We can assume that that might be the poison. So we assume that this is the moment in which, consumed by heartbreak, she decides to take her own life. I think that's the beauty of this painting, because it is able to compress the entire narrative into that one scene. Very strategic decision from Bernardino May's point of view. I think, to answer your question, that's probably the commonality. They always choose the moment that's able to encapsulate all the emotion, all the drama, all the narrative, all the story.
It's very Shakespearean, all of those.
It is, yes.
I don't have a favorite. I really don't. But I'm drawn to this painting of Hyacinth and Apollo, right? I like that painting and the movement of the bodies, and I just love it. But do you think that those paintings were controversial in their time?
So most of them, I think, were, because they evoke such pathos, and they recount stories which are very important to our history. I mean, these are big stories. They come from Ovid's Metamorphoses. They come from the Decameron. They're familiar stories. And even though they might seem very tragic and very sort of violent at times, I mean, they are familiar stories. There's one, however, which didn't have a good reception at all, which is The Unequal Marriage by Vasily Pukirev. The reason why it didn't have a good reception is because I think it was so strikingly real in its depiction of what was happening at the time, and so heartbreaking at the same time as well, that it caused outrage, actually, because it put a mirror up to Russian society. And I think elderly men in particular felt attacked, and they didn't like it at all, to put it shortly. And what ended up happening is that apparently, according to myth, according to legend, after the painting was created, the number of these marriages actually decreased. So, it's sort of barred in a way, or, held back this saddening phenomena of elderly grooms marrying younger brides. Again, it shows you the power of art and its ability to spark change, real change.
Through all of the history, Russian Empire, then Soviet Union, and then now Russian Federation, artists have a really tough time, especially when it comes to expressing their art, whatever it is. It's always controversial, always censored. There is something about Russian mentality and this defiance of people to do stuff like Pussy Riot in the time, Dostoevsky, who was almost shot dead, and we would never have any of those books, these classics, if he was shot. Why are we always going back to these tragic stories all over the world, all over again, all the time?
It's a question that I still don't have an answer to, but it was part of the reason why I wanted to write this book, because I think that is very much a truth, that we are always drawn to stories that make us sad, ultimately. It's a strange paradox. It might seem like a strange paradox. It's the fact that they come up again and again, and they've been around since ever, and from all these important literary writers, I think does attest to that. My explanation for it, which might not be true, but this is what I think it provides such a strong form of catharsis, because we all experience tragedy. It's a part of life that, good things will happen and bad things will happen, of course. And when we hear sad stories, I think it's a way for us to channel our own experiences through those stories. So for me, I see it as emotional catharsis. It's the purging that it allows us to feel. I think that's what draws people to stories that are sad or feel sad or deal with themes like tragedy, lost love, heartbreak. I mentioned this in the introduction, but what I hope that audiences can take from this book is not only enjoying these beautiful paintings and learning about different artists, but also being able to have that moment of catharsis themselves through these stories. And I think that it provides art that deals with these themes, allows for a purging.
I don't know why we are driven by that. But also in the same time, you have a YouTube and I have a YouTube and podcast. And what is popular is these very short pranks and all of that stuff. So there is also entertainment as well. My point is, and please let me know if I'm wrong, that those people maybe in any time had entertainment and they had art. And art is the one that survives, whatever it is. And
Yeah.
there is timelessness, immortality, no pun intended, but immortality in it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you've said has just kind of clarified something for me. We all have different experiences that, without a shadow of a doubt, we've all lived in different times, in different contexts, with, different surroundings, different people, different thoughts, different lessons. But I think what is common to all of humanity are emotions. No matter what time you're living in, or whether you're born in the time of technology or a time without technology, whether the entertainment is via social media or via plays, I think the commonality is emotion. So that's, I think, why we are always drawn back to these stories, because in some shape or form we all experience lows and tragedy. No matter if it's big or small, it always feels like a tragedy to the person experiencing it. So that's the absolute definitive commonality to all of humanity. So I agree with what you're saying. And that's probably, again, why we're drawn to these stories.
How these works that you chose for your book, how will I put it this? In your book that you chose, these artworks, how does the use of color contribute to emotional tone or emotional whatever?
Again, I think it depends on the works. One that comes to mind, it's called Melancholy, Edgar Degas. This painting really struck me because it's overwhelmingly red. The title is melancholy, so it suggests already that we're dealing with a heavy emotion. And it depicts this woman who's sort of curled up in this armchair, and she's obviously looking quite distressed. She's wearing red herself, but her surroundings are also this deep crimson that evoke this sense of danger and pain and heartbreak and turmoil. So I think in that case, the color red has been used very deliberately to evoke that sense of violent pain. And that's why I interpreted this work as being about heartbreak, because I think overwhelmingly the color really does speak of that. The red of the painting implies that there's this fireplace just before the woman, again, adding to this sense of fury, not fury in the sense of anger, but fury of involving those feelings of having lost something or had something slip through your fingers in a romantic sense, at least. That's how I saw the painting. So in that case, yeah, color absolutely adds to the emotional impact. There's a work by Ari Scheffer, which depicts Francesca da Rimini. This is a story from the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. It's based on a true story. The wonderful thing about Dante Alighieri is that even though he wrote this sort of fictionalized narrative poem, he involved a lot of real characters in it. So it's both fact and fiction in a sense. This is a story about Francesca da Rimini and Paolo Malatesta. So Francesca was set up to marry Giovanni Malatesta, who was quite elderly, quite disfigured. And so they ended up having quite an unhappy marriage. During their marriage, she meets Giovanni's younger, more handsome brother, Paolo, and they end up having an affair. Giovanni finds them in a moment of intimacy, and he, in a violent fury, he murders them both. And because Francesca and Paolo were guided by lust and love and passion, or at least that's how the story goes, they are banished to the second circle of hell, which is reserved for lustful sinners. This, again, in the context of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Francesca and Paolo, they're sort of depicted in this embrace, and they're suspended in the air and sort of engulfed by this billowing white drapery. The use of color, I think, is fantastic in spotlighting their pain in this case. We have them spotlit against this dark, indiscriminate background, so the focus is immediately and wholly on them. So I think in that case, Ari Scheffer, he really uses the contrast of light and dark to draw our attention to the heart of the story, the intensity of the heartbreak that these two figures are experiencing. So it depends, yeah, but those are two examples, I think, of color being used really well to heighten specific aspects of the stories and to draw our attention to different protagonists that are being depicted in the paintings themselves.
What about symbols like flowers, reoccurring symbols that shift meanings across time, or they're always there for us to interpret it as it is?
I'm trying to think if there's like a common symbol that comes up again and again in these particular paintings. But I mean, flowers are a great example. They've been used since ever to evoke different ideas because there are so many different species of flowers over time. It's become a thing to sort of associate different flowers with different ideas or different feelings, as it were. I can't really think of one in my book. There's a beautiful painting by Constant Mayer, which is called Love's Melancholy. And it's just this woman who's standing alone on this hill and she's looking despondently downwards. And this one was an interesting one to write about because I couldn't really find much surrounding the historical context. Sources suggested that it was written at the end of the American Civil War. Towards the bottom of the painting, you get the sense that she might be looking towards a grave. We have a church spire in the background. From the context, we can assume perhaps that she's mourning the loss of her loved one. And hence the title Love's Melancholy. You can really feel the sadness in her face. But what I noticed, there's a small flower that's visible in the bottom left corner, a blue flower. And I think everything that you see in a painting, down to the smallest detail, is always intentional on the part of the artist. They always intend for something to come across. It was, an intentional decision to include that particular flower. And so I interpreted it as a symbol of hope. That after all this tragedy and destruction and loss of love, this single blue flower hints at some way at rebirth and sparks the smallest of hopes. So we sense that this woman will love again. She will get past the tragedy. It will pass, as will everything. So in that sense, you've got symbols which add certain symbolic layers and hints, as it were, to the paintings. And in this case, provide a hopeful feel to what is a very tragic scene being depicted.
Wow, what a good answer. Are there paintings in your book that you chose that are hiding some what is the word? I just wonder if there is any subversive or coded meanings.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's why I love art because, depending on the artwork, the more you dig, the more you tend to discover these sort of hidden subversive, subliminal messaging that is sometimes unique to the artist, or it could relate to the time in which it's created, the context of a particular story, a particular historical event. Art is brilliant for that because it allows you to pack this messaging into a visual form. I think there's only one, perhaps, that is full of symbolism, and it's why I included it, aside from also its emotional impact, and I think that just the beauty of what it's depicting. It's Beata Beatrix again by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He's one of my favorite artists of all time. He was a pre-Raphaelite painter, and his artworks, they embody this timeless elegance and epicness. It's hard to sort of put into words. But anyway, this painting of Elizabeth Siddal in the guise of Beatrice Portinari, who, as we discussed, was Dante Alighieri's forever love. He never actually really met her or got to know her, but he would always admire her from afar. Anyway, this painting is full of symbols that allude to Elizabeth's life and the nature of her death. If you didn't really know the details of her death or her story, this messaging wouldn't come through. But Gabriele Rossetti, he knew her so intimately. So for him, it was a way to sort of pour all these details and these narrative layers into the work. To give you two concrete examples, we see Elizabeth herself, who's taking up the majority of the painting. She's got her palms before her, and they're sort of opened up as if she's welcoming this dove that it looks as if it's about to settle in her palms. The dove itself holds an opium poppy in its beak, and I think that, considering the context of how Elizabeth passed away, it could be, and probably is, an intentional nod to the fact that she died by suicide from a laudanum overdose. So that's a very clear link to a real biographical truth. And also you'll notice that in the right background of the painting, just before the figure of Dante, who's seen in the far right, there's a sundial. And actually the sundial itself, again by Rossetti, has very intentionally been placed to reflect another biographical truth. It casts a shadow over the number 9, which echoes the date of Beatrice's death on the 9th of June, which I think is just so, again, it's so... That refers to Beatrice's death, but again, it's this subliminal messaging which really provides so much depth to the story being depicted. And they're almost like little Easter eggs for audiences to pick up the more they learn about the story. So that's one example I think that I can think of in terms of actual symbolism. No matter how much you are intrigued to find out more, because we have this woman who's taking up the majority of the canvas. She's gazing upwards. She's sort of surrounded by this heavenly glow. So you get the sense that she's not of this earth and she's neither of the heavens. She's somewhere perhaps in between, an indeterminate state. So that in itself, I think, will encourage any viewer to sort of dive deeper. I think you get the sense that there is a lot of messaging coming through the painting. You've got two further figures in the background. You've got this sundial, which is being very intentionally lit. So Rossetti's drawing attention to it. It's sort of surrounded by its own halo. The dove, the puppy in its beak, I think upon first glance, they might appear quite random. And that in itself encourages audiences to delve deeper. You can feel the emotion behind it. You can. And I think you get the sense that it is about love, even without delving into the details and the context.
Do you think that these works will continue to resonate with people in the future as they resonated with us or the audience in the time they were made?
Absolutely. That, without a shadow of a doubt, I think that that's the power of art and any sort of art form that is able to evoke emotion. Because I think, as we've discussed, we all have different experiences and we all live completely different lives. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We are all our own individual people and we all have different ways of approaching the world. But what does remain constant is emotion. And I think no matter where you come from or what time you're living in, the emotions that these paintings evoke, even without the contextual knowledge and the historical knowledge, are timeless and they will last and they will have the same impact. I think that for sure.
Yeah, I have so many questions. And last time you said that I ask difficult questions. So I'm trying not to do this time. But I have this need to ask you how these paintings, who are many centuries old, speak about human condition.
Wow. I think what they show is that we are, as a species, we are always guided by feeling. So we are always guided by love. We are always in pursuit of love, and we are always heartbroken by losing it. If we're looking at my book in particular, that is the overwhelming sense that I get from all these works, because they all deal with that theme. So I think it just shows that we are overwhelmingly guided by our base emotions, and love overwhelmingly. We all crave it and we all need it and we all want to feel it and we want to give it too.
You know, you spoke about tragic love stories. So, do you believe that these tragic love stories endure because they promise some kind of a form of immortality?
That's a good question. I think yes, in a sense, perhaps they do. Um, yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not sure how to answer this one. I think love promises with it, um, or has this sort of connotation of lasting forever. You know, when you say that you love someone, you have that. It's like you're making a silent promise that it will last forever. So in a sense, I think love, abstractly speaking, has that sense of timelessness to it. And by talking about stories that involve love, then in a sense they become timeless in themselves. Yeah, I think so.
Mm.
That wasn't the best answer.
No, it was your answer. Do you feel that dreams, grief, passions are really truly timeless, or do they have a, or do they fade with people who painted them?
I think that if they're, I think they are timeless. I think depending on how they're made timeless. For example, the Rossetti painting. Rossetti is no longer alive, but his story and his love for Beatrice and Elizabeth in real life will now live on forever through that work of art, or through even in a secondary nature through my replication of his work of art in my book. In some way, they will keep being brought up again and again and again, and it's fascinating to think that that's the case. But that's the beauty of art, because it is able to capture something, condense something into a format that is actually two-dimensional, and keep it there for years to come.
These stories in the future, will they be destined to be forgotten?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, they've lasted this long. And despite the time that we're living in, which is a heavily digital world, they still very much persevere, because again they touch upon these sort of universal, instinctual, very human emotions. So I think they will last for as long as we happen to be around. I think especially so in our age, because it's becoming easier to transmit information and to tell these stories via digital means. So yes, I think they will last. And even if the details of the stories are perhaps lost over time, I think the emotional impact of them will, for certain, remain fully intact.
Yeah, there's paintings that are destroyed in the Second World War, but we still have photos of them in real good quality and we
Yeah,
can study
exactly.
them.
Yeah.
You know, I often think about those artists who produce those art, and sometimes people don't know much about their lives, how brilliant they are in depiction of tragedy, love, rejection, or whatever they're depicting.
Yeah, I think, yeah, ultimately, because we're living in a different historical context, that the immediacy of, let's say, a historical event being depicted, we of course will never be able to understand as much as the people that were living it themselves. But the actual emotions, I think, and the depiction of, let's say, tragedy in this case, that can't change, because it is something that any of us can experience in spite of the historical context. But the feelings and emotions, those will be there for
Mm.
sure. In a way, it might intensify, as you said as well. Yeah, over time.
Remember those three questions that I always ask in the end?
I
Uh,
do. I remember a couple of them. Yes.
yeah. So maybe you changed the answer. It was a year ago. What is art?
Art, I think, is any form of intentional emotional expression.
If you could meet anybody from history, artist or historical character or character from literature or myth, who would it be and why? But from your book, who would it be?
Oh, from my book. That's a good question. I think. Good question. I think I would choose Elizabeth Siddal, because she's featured both in the form of the painting's protagonist, but also as an artist in of herself. So I have a work by her, and then she's also featured in this painting by Rossetti. She was a fantastic artist and poet herself. At one stage, she was the only female being exhibited in a pre-Raphaelite exhibition. But her life was also filled with so much tragedy, and she does appear again and again throughout art history in paintings by different artists. She was also very famously painted as Ophelia by Sir John Everett Millais, which is a tragic painting in and of itself. myself. I think I'd love to meet her and just talk to her and just to get a sense of what she was going through, because obviously, her life ended quite tragically. So getting an insight into her mindset would be fascinating.
How would you like to be remembered?
Oh, I remember this. This was my favorite question. I don't remember what I said, but answering it now, I would like to be remembered as somebody who made art history accessible and fun and interesting, and who helped to sort of foreground female artists in particular, because I know that hasn't really often been the case.
How people can find your book?
You can find it via my website, but it's also available on Amazon. Then it should come up.
By the way, how does it going with the book?
It's going well. I'm really pleased. I've been having a lot of good feedback. I think the aim has translated well, because the aim of the book was to make it accessible and easy to digest. The point was not to make a very dense book, but at the same time, I wanted the density of emotion and information to be there. So as a book, you can come back to it whenever you feel like you need a moment of emotional catharsis. You don't have to read it from front to back. You can choose one story at a time. I intentionally left the texts quite short because I wanted the focus to be on the artworks themselves. And I think that's translated really well. I think people appreciate that because it is a slightly different way of approaching art history and a slightly different art historical book, let's say.
I would encourage you to write a new book, maybe about some other period in time, about something else, like war or some different kind of, or flowers, whatever.
Thank you.
You are art historian. You will find good themes.
Yes, well, projects are in the works, so I will tell you that. So yeah, things will be coming out soon.
Yes. Thank you for doing this again. I wish you a good day. I'm very happy that we did this. I hope we will do this in the future, within a year again, when you have another book. Maybe.
Yes, definitely. I look forward to that. And thank you again for having me on. It's always a pleasure having dialogues with you and just, talking about a shared passion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.